ज्ञानभक्तिपराख्य संकोलं दुरन्तर संदोषं नित्यदिरप्ति सुखिर्वं स्वच्छिदानन्दस्वरूपं निरुष्टिलयपोदभवनादीदं ब्रह्मज्ञान शिवोऽहं शिवोऽहं केशकालवस्त्रपरिच्छेदरहितं सुसादिविसादि.
Welcome, everyone, to the 7th episode of Om-gnosis, the Occult South Asia podcast. Here, we are very fortunate to be joined by Professor Dr. Julian Strube from Georg August Universität in Göttingen. And is it Georg? Or
Georg, yeah.
Georg August Universität Göttingen. And the main research interests of Julian are global history and entangled history approaches in religious studies with a focus on India, Bengal, Europe, and North America, religion and politics, social reform, colonialism, ethno-nationalism, and racism, religious comparison and cultural exchange since the early modern period, and esotericism and alternative religiosity. So a big range of sort of critical evaluation and analysis. And I've known Julian, I think we determined since 2016 at an SB conference and have kept in touch since then. And it's a real pleasure. I've read Global Tantra, of course, your book that I look forward to talking about as well, one of your books. And just thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So, I was wondering if we could start by you telling us a little about your background, especially what drew you into the study of global esotericism and specifically South Asia, and also your positions. I know you were previously employed in Vienna and Austria and now Germany.
Yeah. Well, I do have a religious studies background. I was part of the old German uni system. So that was pre-BA-MA. So the way it worked back then is that you could choose subjects quite flexibly. So what I studied was first philosophy and history. I studied ancient history. I actually have a degree in medieval and early modern history.
Wow.
Fun fact. But religious studies was in the mix and gradually took over. And it kind of led me to the stuff that I'm doing right now from very early on. Actually, it's a funny circle in a way that's being closed. I really got interested in the subject of esotericism in not really so directly related class that revolved around the relationship between Christianity and Hinduism. It was part of a module that it wasn't called a module back then, but it was a module basically in the philosophy program. So I wasn't even a student of philosophy of religious studies at that point. And in that class, when it was about the 19th century, and the class was taught by the scholar who ended up to be my PhD supervisor. In that class, in the 19th century session, there was a lot of language about Aryans. Aryans. And I, as a tiny little puppy, was wondering, so why did that notion of Aryans end up with the Nazis? Like, what happened there? And I was basically allowed, you could say, to write a paper on Ariosophy was what I eventually chose. And I did realize that this is a very important subject, very fascinating in dark ways too, that at the same time is super under-researched and paradoxically super sensationalized in pop culture. So that was what really got me hooked. I changed to religious studies. It gradually became my main subject, and I kind of stuck with the focus.
Yeah, I guess it stuck on, and then it led to positions, I guess, in
Oh yeah, the
Vienna and then
position.
Germany.
Yeah, the postdoc mill. I did a couple of postdoc positions in Heidelberg. There was that cluster of excellence. It's a stupid concept, but that's what it's called. Asia and Europe. I then got a German research foundation funded project that basically turned out to be my Habil, the basically third book, the Global Tantra book. I had a position in Münster, which was another one of those clusters, religion and politics. And from there, I made it to Vienna, which was a wonderful time. And I got my position in Göttingen as a chair last April. It's almost a year.
Wow. Well, congratulations. Yeah, for that. And it's been nice to sort of track your journey along the way, going in parallel directions here. So, your dissertation and first book was Socialism, Catholicism, and Occultism in 19th century France. And, quite a change. I'm sure we'll get to how this, connects in general to your current interests. And in this connection, I know you've also deeply researched Éliphas Lévi and, Alphonse Louis Constant and the infamous Baphomet figure. And I'm wondering, can the development of occultism in France shed any light on global transfers of occultism, such as in South Asia, or are these mostly unrelated? And I guess a side question would be, how are you defining occultism and, occult and so on? Yeah.
Yeah, it was basically already a transition from an earlier research focus I had developed from an early point on, and that was the far right stuff, the Völkisch context, 19th century up to what I then termed like esoteric neo-Nazism, the whole Black Sun business, and so on. That was the first book, and then I took up my PhD and put out that second book about the socialism
Okay.
business.
So this is your second book. Okay.
Yeah. If we talk
Okay.
about like my
Yeah.
research foci, like we will probably end up talking about what I'm doing at the moment, and
I
I'm
see.
kind of closing that circle, But this indeed, like what really got me hooked is something extremely influential yet under researched or under acknowledged in certain disciplines, at least, and in religious studies, that's very much socialism. So the deal with those early socialists is that they were extremely religious and they were very weird. We were talking about pre-Marxist. Those Marxists that Engels in 46 labeled utopian socialists.
Okay.
In contrast to scientific socialism, which of course was historical materialism and Marxism. So these early socialists were basically the circles where spiritualism emerged. They were connected to all kinds of alternative religious movements, if you will. They wanted to, found new churches, had a very, let's say, esotericism heavy language. In those circles, it was actually often where notions of esoteric, occult, etc., were shaped. And very famously, Éliphas Lévi, as you mentioned, whose civil name was Alphonse Louis Constant, was one of those weird early socialists, and almost a priest, but a trained theologian who got sacked shortly before his consecration as a priest. So he has a very particular and peculiar background of socialism, often termed romantic socialism. So you have romanticism in the mix, socialism, weird kinds of Catholicism that were called neo-Catholicism. And if you then look at the state of scholarship about Éliphas Lévi and the emergence of occultism at the time, the narrative that you have is, yes, I mean, if it's mentioned at all, usually it is mentioned, but in a way, yeah, you had this early Alphonse Louis Constant, the socialist, but then there was like a rupture or U-turn even, and then he became the occultist Éliphas Lévi. And yeah, what I try to show is that there is a very fundamental continuity, accompanied by many ruptures. There's always ruptures and continuities. But this thing that he called occultism, the term was around already a bit, but not in a specific sense. The thing that he called occultism basically signified true religion. True religion is Catholicism, but true Catholicism, which is not to be found in the churches, and true Catholicism is occultism. Why is it occult? Because it's hidden from the masses who don't understand the true doctrine, and so on. Quite standard narratives at the time. He didn't do anything special, and it was the most interesting thing about that. Like he took these ideas that were around in socialist circles, in romantic circles, artists, and that's what basically formed the foundation of what he called occultism. Always with the caveat that he is the one who holds the key to the truth. So what is occultism? Occultism is not a thing. Occultism is, or signifies, like occult are related to all kinds of developments at the time. Struggles about the relationship between religion and science, occult properties, which is a very old idea, in the light of contemporary science, electricity, magnetism, especially at that time, occult forces, literally, that can be employed, that people at the time understood as the workings behind supposed miracles, behind magic, and so on. That's a very large discourse, mainstream discourse, if you will, trying to explain religion, experiences, all kinds of phenomena through occult forces. That's one particular strand. And of course, I'm super simplifying here, but
Right.
The other strand that you can oversimplify is the idea of doctrine, and again, this is very widespread at the time, not least in those so-called neo-Catholic circles, the idea there is a primordial revelation. There is a universal truth. That, however, got distorted, lost, degenerated. The access to that truth is only available to a select few who are capable of seeing it. And that's another meaning of occult. You have something literally hidden, obscured from the masses. And these kinds of narratives can be spun in all kinds of different ways and directions. They can be differently politically charged. Usually they are very politically charged. And that is why it's not a thing. It's constantly contested what that means. And towards the end of the 19th century, it takes on very different shapes and meanings, but that is basically the moment I looked at, the 1820s till 70s, 80s, 90s especially. And that is where it's becoming really clear that these subjects like esotericism, occultism are not isolated strands, but they are part of very prominent historical developments.
Great. And then as we see, it also gets into South Asia, which I suppose we can combine that into the next question here, which is, we're calling Om-gnosis here the first podcast or video cast devoted to Occult South Asia. From the conference we both attended of that same name in Vienna several years ago, sponsored by Mriganko Mukhopadhyay and Karl Bayer. And this idea builds on the broader associations of occult as hidden on the one hand, that one strand that you're looking at, where theosophists are referring to occultism as Gupta Vidya, the hidden science. But I guess you've partially answered this question, but I'm curious, how does this other strand that you're talking about with sort of doctrine and so on, inform your work, in the specifically South Asian context?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's reasons why I developed quite a different focus after the PhD, which is not the most usual thing to do. Really shifting gear and learning new languages, working about a new region, and so on. And one of the major reasons was that you do not understand any of that without the context of cultural exchange, global connections, Orientalism, and so on. What happens at the beginning of the 19th century? Already at the end of the 18th century, you have the beginnings of colonialism, British colonialism, at least in India. You have a gradual establishment of like the British Raj, which happens much later, but the East India Company and so on. And that context enabled basically the emergence of Orientalist studies as we know them, studies that are focused on India. There are many reasons why they are so much focused on India, but a very crucial and really paradigm shifting reason is the discovery, if you will, that there is a linguistic relationship between the European languages and the Indian languages, especially Sanskrit, some Indian languages, a language family. So there is this assumption at the time that language, religion, and what is called nation or people, and then increasingly race, quote unquote, in the 19th century, are inherently intertwined. So if you find a common language family, a linguistic relation, in that mindset, it means that culture, race, quote unquote, religion, and so on are also related. Which is why Friedrich Max Müller, the famous religious studies scholar, classified religions according to languages. And what was his category? Aryan. The category was established relatively late in the 19th century. You have terminology like Indo-European and so on. The fact that in the German context it's called Indo-Germanic to this day actually already points at the nationalist implications of all of that, which are very strong. And that is basically the backdrop against also these ideas in the socialist, the Catholic, and so on context are discussed when it comes to the origin of religion and so on. And that is also the backdrop against which people since the 18th century discuss magnetism and so on, in the sense that they try to locate the origin of a primordial science that is often identified also with magic in India. So people have that gaze towards India. And it was clear to me when I worked on this that I really needed to broaden my perspective to a global one to really understand what's going on. And that's how I ended up basically there. I could have ended up somewhere else, but for the reasons I just discussed and this particular focus that I had, India and then specifically Bengal at the time were like the way to go, the most obvious way to go. So Occult South Asia. I think what the term is useful for is to also allude to the source language, because that is really the platform where people, for instance, from the Theosophical Society, and then crucially Indian and other local actors are discussing these matters. Basically, they quarrel about the relationship between religion and science. Many of these Orientalist cliches are being turned around by Indian actors by saying, for instance, yes, the Western modern science is materially superior because they have all this military power, they are able to colonize us, but it is only superficial, materialistic, and hence destructive. Whereas the ancient Aryan wisdom, the true science, the complete science that takes everything into account, is also non-materialist. And then you have very different terminology where people argue what that means: spiritual, occult, non-materialistic, and so on. And so again, we have this broader context of debates about religion and science, the role of religion in society, and this is precisely where the Theosophical Society was so successful in the Indian context and became such a significant force, because these debates were not marginal. They were very prominent, and they were very significant or they are very significant for an understanding of this historical context, these developments.
Definitely, yes. I agree with that, and I'm curious. I didn't, before we get into sort of your work on global tantra, I didn't prepare this question, but what you're saying has sort of, brought up this idea for me, which is that, as you alluded to, there are many languages in India and in South Asia, and there are whole language families that are not necessarily Indo-Aryan, right? Like thinking of the South Indian languages, that come from the Dravidian language family, for instance. And I'm wondering if you've come across any attempts by the Theosophical Society, or even like in Max Muller's day, to try to account for sort of, these other families that don't really fit into the, Indo-Aryan narrative. Like, how are they somehow sort of glossed over as Aryan anyway, or how does it work?
These categories are extremely unprecise and unstable. And you can observe that, for instance, in the work of Müller, like his categories, they are all over the place. They change over time. They get very different connotations. At some point, he's then also busy distancing himself from the Völkisch interpretations of Aryan and so on. So there is no easy answer to that. But that is already the answer. Like, we are talking about heavily contested ideas. There isn't something Aryan out there to discover. Nobody knows what exactly that means. If we talk about the history of the term and so on. But of course, a lot of people do know what it means, just that they have very specific understandings of that. And this is precisely the context of the second half of the 19th century, especially the 1880s, 1890s, where you have all these movements in India that very much insist on Sanatana Dharma, like the eternal, true, unchanging Dharma at the root of, being a Hindu. Which is also where the whole Hindutva ideology emerges out of later in the beginning of the 20th century. But there, in the 19th century, we are talking about anti-colonialism, nationalism, cultural identities, religious national identities. And this notion of Aryan is, of course, a very, also like exclusive one. It plays into the whole dynamics of Brahmanical ideas, for instance. What is Hinduism? Is Hinduism Veda-based? Is it Sanskritic? Is it the business of Brahmins to tell what it really is and to practice it, etc.? And these are exactly the circles where the Theosophists end up in. They do not come to India with a ready-made export product, that could have been exported from the West to India. They didn't come with a clear understanding of theosophy, like not at all. Like everyone who's familiar with theosophy knows that, like it was all over the place. People were struggling. They were arguing what it's supposed to mean. And it
Even
was
in the name change, right? Theosophical Society of Aryavart, initially.
Yes, and the brief alliance with the Arya Samaj, which is of course a major player in all these quarrels at the time, and basically the Theosophists, they get thrown into all these quarrels, and then of course the Theosophists coming from the States, from Europe, and so on, at some point aren't even in the majority anymore. And certainly they are. They are exchanging ideas with. They are in contests about ideas with people who don't just sit there to await explanations what theosophy and Hinduism and religion and science and so on is. But they have their own interests. They have their own ideas. They argue. They shape these discourses, these ideas that determine what occult means, what Hindu means, what religion means, and so on.
Hmm. Yeah, no, thanks for that answer. And I think it really leads us into sort of your work on, promoting the agency, of some of these South Asian actors, especially in the Theosophical Society, who often get sort of overlooked, right? In these discourses of, occultism and esotericism histories. And so, your book in particular, Global Tantra, was an exceptionally important work, I find, that highlighted the important work of the Arthur Avalon collaboration in Discourses of Tantra and connected many previously unexplored links with Bengali authors. And so can you share with our audience how John Woodroffe, this Arthur Avalon collaboration, on the other hand, and his guru Shiv Chandra Bidarnob, or right Shiva Chandra Vidyarnava in the Sanskritized, demonstrate the importance of your global histories approach when considering intersections between occultism and then now we have Tantra in the mix here.
Yeah, that's such an awesome example of the stuff I've been
Mm.
talking about, because at first glance it seems to be such a cliched Orientalist story. Woodroffe was a British judge who in 1915 actually became Chief Justice, so quite high up in the colonial administration in Calcutta. And he also at some point wrote under his civil name, John Woodroffe, uh, describing how only the occultist is able to understand Indian teachings and Indian occultism is the key to understanding, and so on and so on. It smacks of Orientalism, like you would have good reasons to believe that this is some kind of projection of a Western author. So for a long time, the predominant perception was that John Woodroffe was behind Arthur Avalon. What's Arthur Avalon? It's a pseudonym, obviously, or some very creative parents. I don't know, but it's a pseudonym behind very famous red books. Like they're all in red covers. Whole generations well into the 1960s, 70s who are interested in Tantra and related things. They
And the
have them.
2000s, I must confess. I mean, I read them before going to Bangladesh and India. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. I mean, in the 2000s, you have a much larger quantity of studies, and the study of these things has progressed, of course, a lot. But really, way into the 20th century, they were the go-to for that kind of business, and they were mostly published in 1910s, 20s, and 30s. So these red books were instrumental in establishing Tantra as a serious academic subject, but also as a practice among Westerners, for instance, in the States, North America, and in South America, and Europe, like really across the globe. So that again seems to be a tale of Western appropriation and Orientalist imaginaries and so on. Yet, and you already hinted at that, behind that name, Arthur Avalon, was not just Woodroffe, and I would really say not primarily Woodroffe, not at all, which is something that already was made very clear in a book by Kathleen Taylor in the early 2000s, I think 2006 or 2009, something like that. She showed very clearly that there was especially one collaborator, but there were also more, and I looked into that precisely, like larger group, this larger context of mostly Bengali scholars and other learned people who had the linguistic expertise, which Woodroffe didn't have, who had knowledge of all the doctrines, the practices, and so on, and significantly, let's call him Shiva Chandra, or pronounce him Shiva Chandra. He also allegedly and most likely took Woodroffe as his disciple. So Woodroffe is less of a mastermind and more of a figurehead that seems to have been quite consciously employed by or used by these South Asian scholars, because they were quite well aware that he would be a much more respectable source for spreading their ideas. The point is, however, that all of that does not begin with, let's say, Woodroffe's arrival, or let's say his contact with those people. But there is a story predating that in the 1880s, and it really becomes tangible in 1880, where scholars that later also collaborate on Arthur Avalon, Bengalis, choose the Theosophical Society as a platform to communicate their ideas about Tantra to a global audience. They choose the Theosophists in 1880. There is articles about how Tantra is not black magic, how it's not just degeneracy, but it's actually, and that is the term that one of them uses, Tantric Occultism, as the core of Indian teachings. So the exact opposite of degeneracy. It's the true core, appropriate for the Kali Yuga, the current age, where you cannot just live like in Vedic times, but you have to follow certain modes, and the modes are tantric. And there's historical tantras that make that argument, but we have now a situation where these, let's say, Kaula, Shakta, tantric traditional quote unquote arguments are being used in the context of modern science and colonialism. And again, the colonial dynamic is being reversed in very ambiguous ways, because the racism and so is still there. The ideas, the cliches are still there, but they are turned around, for instance, in a way that we just discussed. Modern Western science is inferior to ancient Indian wisdom because it is only materialistic, it's only superficial, and now Tantric Occultism is the way to a broader, more complete understanding of what it's all about.
You can almost sort of feel their excitement, right? I mean, encountering these categories and in your narrative as well, since, it seems like, in studying South Asia, even if Tantra, is not the essence of Hinduism, right? I mean, I don't think that's a faithful way to interpret the study of Hinduism from a historical lens. At the same time, it's interesting that sort of, modern puja, certain rituals, of kingship and so on. It's like you can see echoes of Tantra in there. And I'm wondering if sort of like those echoes then sort of get expanded into this, this kind of blanket statement that, oh, well, of course, Tantra is the essence of, these rituals and so on. And have you sort of encountered any like rationale? Like, did they give any rationale for sort of saying that, like, why they're thinking that Tantra is, this essence or anything like that?
Well, there's of course different people around with different arguments, but there are some arguments that you can encounter quite frequently, quite prominently. For instance, that Tantra is not just about mere philosophizing or theorizing, but it's about practice with concrete, tangible results, which is also an old argument. You then have that linked very explicitly and polemically to the whole modern scientific discourse, because look, this is really not just some, laboratories with fancy equipment, but you can actually get tangible results. That's a very frequent argument. You have very frequently the argument that tantric teachings are secret, they require initiation, they are not available to the masses, and the very fact that they are the core of Hindu Dharma, of Sanatana Dharma, means that we are now in such a terrible state because most people don't know about this true core. And this can be very easily connected to these occultist ideas that are around, that we actually discussed in the context of Éliphas Lévi. It's very easy to make that move, and they do make that move. And not only the interlocutors of the Theosophical Society, it's a broader discourse, it's a broader idea. It's you have a whole discourse among pundits that argue similarly. You have very different people who are sounding so so similar, because this is not an esoteric context. It's very broad developments in the history of religion, of science, of politics, and so on.
Right. And then also the place of Islamic esotericism and all of this too, exchanges with Hinduism. Yeah.
Much
Yeah, absolutely.
neglected by me, yes.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess this then, if we get to this point where, okay, these movements are so broad that, we can't reduce it as many of these authors did to this kind of essence. I'm curious then what is the there? Because, getting into the next question, as you're aware, higher education in several countries, including the United States, has been subject to numerous political challenges in recent months and years. And there's been a lot of increased scrutiny being given to critically evaluating the social and economic relevance of scholarly research questions. And so, I say this in the sense that, you bring up tantric occultism, and people will be like, well, how does that relate to anything, in mainstream religion? I mean, you've laid out a really strong argument for it. I have my own ideas on how it relates as well. But I'm wondering, how would you answer critics who then would claim that, studying these kinds of topics like global Tantra, occult South Asia, even global esotericism and a connected histories approach are irrelevant or unnecessary in the context of humanities or sciences?
Hmm. I mean, the let's say big picture is, of course, the questioning of the humanities in total. Like, why do we need that stuff?
Mm.
There's a very clear reason why we need that stuff. People build their identities, form their political strategies, and most of the things they do on narratives, on historical narratives, most of the time. And you just have to open any newspaper or webpage or whatever, and you can see that like in your face. I have alluded to the example of Hindutva, Hindu nationalism. That is not a marginal subject. That is the subject, a subject that determines the lives of very many people as we speak. And historically understanding it requires looking at the context I've been talking about. Do you need to be familiar with this language of Tantric Occultism to understand it? No, you don't. However, these developments form an integral part of these historical processes, these developments, these debates, these negotiations, these quarrels and struggles about things like the meaning of Hinduism, religion, science, and so on, that do shape basically everything that's going on. And the way, or let's say, any doing of history, any writing of history is always a function of the presence. We are not just doing that out of like boredom, and so maybe some people are, but I would I would make a strong point. I mean, you are not just trying to understand something that happened in the past. You are trying to explain things that are going on right now, points of reference, notions such as Sanatana Dharma, quarrels about the legitimacy of religion, Western identity, like all of these things are inherently intertwined with the stuff we've been talking about so far. So you do need these facets, these aspects we've been talking about to get the full picture. And what very much underscores that is that in major works on these subjects, also from broader history of politics, histories of ideas, and so on, perspectives, they of course they mention the Theosophical Society, but they usually mention it in passing. They acknowledge how important and influential it was, but also very weird, and then they move on. And the weirdness is exactly not the exception. The whole period, the things that were going on there were very weird. Like if you look at the ideas, to stick with the example of Hindu nationalism, or any nationalism for that matter. I mean, let's talk about Germany. Like, it's like
Or
very,
American nationalism.
very much related to
Yeah.
the subjects, not at least Aryan imaginaries and so on.
Mhm.
You do need to look at this to understand it, and it's kind of like coming back to my very first subject, things like these Aryan notions in the Völkisch circles, in the National Socialist circles, up to the present day, neo-Nazism, far-right radicals and extremists, and so on. Like, you need to look at what many people might perceive as obscure and weird and so on, in order to understand where that stuff comes from, to a significant part. And again, underlining the fact that this is not some kind of isolated sphere, but as the Theosophical Society, for instance, shows very clearly, it is part of very major developments, and thus it is absolutely crucial to have people work on that stuff.
Mhm. Agreed, and I can imagine it would also be useful to people, in a wide variety of practitioner contexts. Even as seemingly innocuous as a yoga practitioner or something like that. To sort of just be aware, that these narratives are out there, and sort of what's happening, with the origin of knowledge. So
Yeah, it's of course a big subject, like
yeah.
the role for all of this in the history of yoga. And
Mhm.
there is so much awesome scholarship that has already been produced, that is being produced, and I think it's clear to the vast majority of our colleagues working on that things like the Theosophical Society and so on, they do play a very, very significant role in all of that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So then, I do want to know, where your current work and projects are heading, right? So you mentioned, you alluded to the fact you're kind of going full circle back to your first book. But I've also, we've been in contact. I also hear you often going to Japan, for different projects, and and related
Next time in
works.
2 weeks.
Next time in 2 weeks. All right. So what's going on there? If you could tell us about, where your work is heading, and what you have on the horizon, that'd be great.
Yeah, so the year before last year, 2023, I was in the States, and I wanted to do something nice. It's like, I was very intrigued by Unitarianism, and you have like women's rights, abolitionism, anti-colonialism, like nice stuff. And I collected a lot of material which I will use. Yet, um, as you know, there's a long list of things that happened since then. And I thought that of all the things that I do, the most quote unquote relevant, which is a problematic reason, but let's say the most meaningful, the thing that is most meaningful to me, that I could contribute to what's going on, is actually refocusing on the far right stuff.
Mm.
So I quite drastically shifted gears and completely refocused on the far right stuff. I mean, not completely. The Japan thing is a good example, and other things I've been publishing about like Chinese stuff and missionary interpretations of practices and stuff like that. But especially what I'm doing right now and what I've been doing last year, that is very much focused on far right politics and the role of esotericism therein. A very controversial subject that does require a lot of work, and that also for different reasons. And that to me seems to be the thing that I don't want to do, because I'm not crazy about reading that shit all the time. But it's still the most important thing for me right now. So that's what I'm doing, let's say, also in what I am going to do also in the coming years. Like, I am going to be quite active in that direction. But yeah, the Japan thing is an example of that. Actually, that's pretty nice stuff. Like I should be a bit more
Got a balance.
positive about
Yeah.
that. That's nice. I'm not qualified to work on Japan. Like, I don't have the language. But I do have really wonderful colleagues and friends over there that grew very close to me and over the last couple of years. And we do collaborate very nicely, very efficiently, and I really love their work because it's on such a high academic level on these questions of global perspectives. And they do massively important stuff. I am going to co-edit a volume. We're busy with that right now on the question of like what's esotericism in Asia, in East Asia. What's that? Like, let's talk about that. So we have a bunch of excellent colleagues from China, Korea, Japan, and working on these contexts. Going to be a kick-ass volume. I'm very much looking forward to that. But we are also just going to do a workshop. Yannis Gaitanidis, Orion Klautau are close collaborators with who I will also have a workshop in pretty much 2 weeks now in Tokyo, in Chiba actually. And that's actually very enjoyable, very very fun. It's not like going to archives and read radical far right, neo-Nazi, new right, alt right kind of stuff. Like,
Drivel. Yeah.
keeping me alive.
Yeah. Okay, well, it's good. It's good to have that balance. You can sort of, relax and be in a kind of Zen state, drinking some sake and,
Oh
eating
yes,
rice and tea,
yes.
lots of tea.
Some is good. Yeah, like
There you go.
more than some. But yeah, I basically keep doing what I started the whole thing with, which is always something with politics. And in recent years, I have, of course, very strongly developed also this question of like comparative religion and global historical approaches and that kind of stuff. And I also want to increasingly combine these things, like these particular things, like the far right stuff, which is very doable also when you think about Indian subjects or connections between India and Europe, the States, and so on. For instance, think of the skyrocketing popularity at the moment of Savitri Devi, as she liked to call herself, a contemporary Nazi admirer and then like a hero figure in former Nazi and neo-Nazi circles, very successful in the 70s, for instance, and now again super successful, especially in the States among the extremists. Linked to this whole Black Sun stuff as well. Like listeners can just Google Black Sun. Many will have seen that symbol in some way or another, which is already the problem. And she became a Nazi admirer in Calcutta, like in the 30s. She worked very closely with Hindutva luminaries, including Savarkar's brother Ganesh Savarkar. Yeah, so there's a lot of work to be done, and that's basically the direction.
Yeah, going places where other people really hesitate to tread. But I've always really respected your approach, and sort of you're not just looking at far right, you're also looking at socialism, and left, and all these kinds of political sort of ideologies in a spectrum, and able to sort of penetrate and get to the heart of how these ideologies have real social consequences and how they connect to these worlds of esotericism and occultism that many people sort of just push aside as weird and don't actually want to look at. And so that's really great and amazing work.
Oh man, thank you. That's much appreciated.
No, it's heartfelt. Well, thanks, Julian Strube, for this time and for taking time out of your busy schedule in between travel to join us. And we really appreciate it and look forward to keeping in touch.
Yeah, me too. Like, keep up the great work, and let's also update each other on what you're about at the moment. Like, it would be great to hear more about that. And but for now, thank you very much for letting me babble. looking
No
forward to
problem.
the other episodes as well.
All right, stay tuned for the next episode. Episode 8 will be released in April. So.
നിരന്തര സന്തോഷം നിത്യതിരപ്തി സുഖിർവം സ്വച്ഛിദാനന്ദ സ്വരൂപം നിരുഷ്ടിലയ പോദ ഭവനാതീതം ബ്രഹ്മജ്ഞാന ശിവോ